Hello and welcome to Captains of Industry in Dubai. I'm Chris Bishop and I'm here to speak to a man by the name of Bob Willen. Now he's Managing Director and Chair for Middle East and Africa for worldwide company Kearney. We're here to talk about the business relationship in the region and also the prospect for the economies of the region. Thank you very much indeed for joining me here. Just a little bit about yourself, your background, where you grew up in the United States. What were some of the influences early in your life?
Well, thank you for having me, Chris. It's great to be here. I'm from the New York area. I grew up outside of New York, outside New York City. And
which part was that?
Long Island.
Okay.
Pretty far out. And grew up the son of a German immigrant, like many of us, and also a physicist. So I think at the very early stage, it was a technical upbringing. My mother was a math teacher. My father was a physicist. So I was destined for the sciences somehow.
Was he in industry or was he an academic?
He worked for a national laboratory, Brookhaven National Laboratory. So I guess it was somewhere in between.
So meal tables in the evening must have been quite interesting. You know, you had a teacher on the one side and a physicist on the other. How did your parents try to imbue in you their passion for academics and life in general?
Well, for sure, it was an important subject. How I did at school, what I was learning at school, what I was thinking about along the way. But it was terrific, I have to say. It was. I think they weren't the type to put too much pressure on, but rather more focus on the sort of things I was learning along the way. So, yeah, I think it made me better, much better for it.
Did you have that American childhood, baseball and that sort of stuff when you were growing up?
Yeah, of course. Although I think I'd like to say I also follow football, soccer. Growing up in New York, I think it was international enough that it also gave me a taste for kind of world sport as well.
And this was in the 70s? Or?
This was in the 70s. In
New York Cosmos,
yeah,
and
that's right.
all that stuff. Yeah, and the time when football was starting to get some sort of interest in the United States.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that was a great boom, I'd say, but not quite sustainable at that time. Now it's come back again, of course, but it was a big influence for me.
And you used to go and watch Pelé play for?
I did, yeah, I did. I saw Pelé, Beckenbauer, Carlos Alberto. The Cosmos were a big draw at that point.
And when it came to work there, you became an engineer. You studied hard for that. Is that what you'd set your heart on?
Yeah, I was always intrigued by the space industry, to be honest. Probably had times where I thought maybe being an astronaut was a good thing to do. I don't know how one necessarily gets there. I think you're either, these days, or even in those days, either a pilot or a scientist. Probably I was on path for more of the science route. And I went to work for General Dynamics Space Systems Group that later became what is now the United Launch Alliance, and we were launching satellites. So somehow I think that interest in space fueled those early days in my career.
Must have been exciting times for you. I mean, like at that time it seemed like the sky was the limit. We didn't have maybe the concerns that we have now about the environment and the world economy. What was it like then?
Yeah, I recall then, well, I mean, certainly there were tensions brewing here in the Middle East, but at the same time, there was a lot of excitement about technology, I think, really building. I think that was a period where commercial space flight was becoming real. I think communication satellites and some of the early satellite television systems were coming into play. So there was a lot of excitement around, certainly in the space arena, what was possible.
How many years did you do that for? And also, what did it teach you? What kind of, for want of a better word, dirty jobs did you have to do when you were on the way up?
Well, I think at that time I was a junior engineer, so you were given tasks and you weren't even sure why you were doing some of the things you were doing. You know, that was probably staying up late, solving models, programming, these sorts of things. I think that's kind of how you made yourself busy. And certainly as a junior engineer, I had my share.
And then you progressed and you moved away to Kearney 24 years ago. Is that correct?
That's right.
Well, what was the reason for the big switch?
I had a stopover in business school, and then out of that pursued consulting. I think it was probably a transition for sure for me. I think even as an engineer, I wanted to be, I was intrigued by some of the leadership questions, some of the maybe programmatic questions of the problems we were dealing with. And through business school and I think early days in consulting, you start to see sort of the challenges that companies face, that economies face, that organizations face, and I think I was really, I was intrigued by that.
And did it give you the same kind of buzz that engineering, obviously engineering was your life up to then, did it give you that same kind of buzz or what? Or?
Even more, because I think they're more, maybe they're, you might say simpler issues. At the same time, you can actually see a difference. You can see it every day, what businesses do, what governments do. These are very important issues, and they affect so many people. I think as an engineer, sometimes you work on a smaller problem. It's a complicated problem, but once you solve it, you don't know where it goes next.
When you came into Kearney, and then how was the world economy? What was happening at the time? What were the stories of the day?
Yeah, I think it was certainly in the United States, it was a stable period. I mean, this was then kind of in the late 90s. I think there was still some level of growth. I think we were also kind of dealing with year 2000, as well as the dawn of the .com, the first .com era. So again, back to technology and the way technology has changed the business world. I think you were really starting to see that at that point in time.
Just take yourself back to those days. What was it that really got you excited in the mornings when you were going to work in this new job of business consulting?
I think this was a time where everything was possible, it seemed. When the economy was generally doing okay, technology was emerging, so you started to see these ideas coming out that you could change the world somehow through a business venture, right? There were no limits, it seemed. And I think that kind of penetrated that whole era. We could make change, you could come up with a new idea, develop a new technology, and then the sky was the limit.
The same as what it was when you were launching satellites in some ways. But, what were some of the big names and big deals you worked on in those days?
Yeah, I was at that time doing a lot of work in consumer products. That was probably my earlier years in consulting. And I think there it was really, through technology, the global reach that a company could have, a global consumer products company. Unilever, Procter & Gamble, Kimberly-Clark, some of these sorts of companies where you could really reach almost the entire world with a global branding message. You could connect and then actually create momentum behind a brand. So I think you started to see that in that era as well.
And were there any particular times that you recall were quite testing in those days? Because as I say, we come into the new century, there was a lot of uncertainty around, there was another conflict looming in the Middle East here. What were the feelings of the day?
I think, well, for me, I think a first step was I had the opportunity to work out of Brussels for 4 years. This was right around the year 2000. And I think Europe was becoming Europe. So I think the first step in my own development, my own career, that was a fascinating time to see Europe trying to do more together. And again, probably a interesting insight to the challenges of today and what Europe has become and with Brexit and the like. But at that moment, I think it was filled with optimism about what Europe could be and the way companies could operate across Europe.
Well, what are your feeling about world economies? I mean, the world economies are more interconnected than they've ever been. But on the other hand, it seems to me there's this terrible sense of nationalism, inward-looking, more insular political thought going on. What are your fears for the world economy?
Well, I think you described it very well, Chris. I think things are more connected than they've ever been before. I mean, if you look at supply chains, you look at value chains, getting a product to a market, any market, it comes from all over the world, not just China or Asia, but you see inputs coming from so many different places. And when there's a trend back towards localization, provincialism, and these things, then that gets in the way of the way, I think, how globalization has led the economy to develop. So it's concerning. That's concerning, because I think to do that, make that change too quickly is a real risk.
How much do you fear that some nations, I mean not all, some nations will go back to these sort of small, cut-off, insular economies again, protectionist?
Yeah. I'm optimistic. I think, again, given my maybe some of my background, I hope and I don't believe that will happen, although there will be many pressures to have that happen. And I think one of the other things we're facing now is kind of the carbon taxes and the penalties one pays around sustainability and the like. That'll also push probably more of a local influence. But I just don't think it can move that quickly.
Because that's it. I mean, you mentioned carbon tax there and the environment as well. There are certain things being considered now and talked about in the world economy that would have been 20 years ago, would have been unthinkable. What do you think, looking ahead, are going to be the next big issues around that people are going to start thinking about?
Well, I think it's finding that balance between, let's say, a kind of a global trading system, which has now been set up over the last 20, 25, 30 years, and these pressures to be even more local. So what are the right trade-offs? What are the right decisions to make? How does an organization kind of balance the two? And I think there's then a lot of pressures from local governments as well as, let's say, citizens to also provide more kind of local benefits.
I mean, a lot of us in business, we always think, oh, well, it's okay, the market will sort it out eventually. It'll be a little slip between cup and lip, but I don't know. I mean, with your experience in business, what's your feeling about it?
I think that markets do a great job to sort it out, but there needs to be enough time. And that's the concern that I have, is that I think sometimes the expectations are that these changes happen overnight. I think the current trading system, if you call it globalization and trade flows and the way they are, has taken 20 to 30 years to build this way. We can't then turn around and change it very quickly. I think we can push the pace, and I think in many ways it is happening, but it can't happen too quickly either.
And lastly, in this half, we'll be talking wider issues in the second half. But this half, the country of your birth, I mean, how convinced or otherwise are you that it's still an influence to good when it comes to business and capitalism? A lot of people are fearing what they're seeing and hearing about America first and all the rest of it. What do you think?
Well, I have to be honest, I fear it as well. I think that the U.S. has always stood for I think free trade to start, and being a role model for the rest of the global economy. And I think some of the trends that you see today, I think it's going against that. So I have my own concerns about that, and I also think it's working against perhaps maybe that pinnacle of hope, that beacon that the U.S. has always stood for.
And what do you think is the way out of this, you think, if there is a way?
Well, I think, the one probably great thing about today's world is how connected people are. And I think the younger generations are incredible about how they interact with each other, and I think that can be put to good use also in solving problems. So I'm optimistic, and part of it probably also comes back to the newer generation.
We're right in the middle of Dubai here, Expo 2020. It's just around the corner now. It's going to be a huge shot in the arm for the economy here. How huge is it likely to be, you think?
Oh, I think it's tremendous. And I think probably as the years have gone on, the expo itself gets bigger and bigger. I think as the world is more connected, this is a way to bring people together, and I think the whole region is looking forward to this.
Actually, funny enough, talking about as the years go on bigger, it all dates back to the Great Exhibition in London in the 1860s or whatever. So it's incredible that it's finally arrived here. They say at least 10 million visitors. Some say even more. I mean, how many people do you think could come here, and what could it do for investment?
Well, I think 10 million is the number that we've seen as well, and I think it's a very reasonable number. I think if you look at the normal kind of tourism patterns here to the region, I think 10 million is a good number. I think it could lead to a variety of different investment, and I think what the region here hopes for is that it's not just to Dubai or just to the UAE, but it also sort of spills into the broader region as well. So I think there's a lot of optimism about what Expo 2020 will bring. I think we're all optimistic across probably every area that we're working.
And it's incredible, actually. I mean, every time you look out the window in Dubai, you see somebody building something somewhere. Yeah, how much more infrastructure is likely to go up, you think, ahead of Expo 2020?
Well, I think there's probably no doubt that there's an element of preparing and readiness for an event like this. You know, I think more office space, more hotel rooms, more restaurants, everything in preparation for that. So, you know, I would imagine that there's a level of investment which is very much geared towards Expo 2020. You know, and I think, though, you've also seen probably over the years Dubai can sustain a lot of investment through different periods and through different cycles.
And they're saying something like 110,000 hotel rooms alone to take in the visitors here. It'll certainly put Dubai on the map. The economy here, I mean, the world economy has been going through a very difficult spot now for about 10 years or so. But the economy here in Dubai, how do you see it developing?
I think it's an interesting time. And, you know, I think first, when we talk about Expo 2020, I think there's also a lot of tourism, a lot of trade-related guests as well. You know, and I think that at times is also somewhat resilient to the rest of the economy. But ultimately, I think we see this as a very positive influence, very large potential as well as to what could develop.
And where's the investment coming from to Dubai here? Where's the big money coming from, and where are the hot spots to invest here?
I think that, well, one, I think Dubai and the region here have positioned themselves very well to almost welcome investment from anywhere in the world. I think you see many more visitors and interest from China, other Asian countries. I think you see traditionally from Europe, and Russia, of course, has a big interest here and is making investments. And, of course, some of the long-standing relationships with the U.S. and others. So, you know, one of the things I think this region has done a very good job of is being quite open to the world.
And also, it works, it's organized as well. Is there anything else do you think that Dubai could do, you think, to try to catch even more world investment?
Well, I think it's hard to say that they could do something better, because I think it's been an extraordinary success story. And I see the future perhaps even brighter, too, because I think they've shown that they're open for business, they're open to visitors. They talk about tolerance and welcoming, and I think they're very sincere and genuine in that. I think certainly the pivot to Africa, I wouldn't know if I would call it a pivot, but I think, you know, they're at a strategic location in the world as well. And I think the transportation network also helps that, because it connects people from all over.
And that's another role that Dubai plays, a bit of a hub for investment into Africa. How are you seeing that role growing in the future?
Well, I think, again, there's just a combination of, let's say, transportation and logistics, and hopefully I think the belief is that that can also serve as a trading hub where the money kind of moves through here, becoming more and more of a financial center every day, Dubai is. And I think with the transportation links that they have, the airport access and the like, that could also help with Africa. I think probably on the other side, maybe the developments of the Africa Free Trade Agreement will also help be a better, let's say, a better partner in general to Dubai.
And the African continent, how are you seeing the health of the African continent? It's been a very difficult few years. Many jobs have been lost.
Yeah.
A lot of investors, unfortunately, have seen fit to pull out in recent years. But I mean, how do you see the economy battling ahead to the future?
Yeah, I'm again optimistic. And I think probably the dynamic that we see in our business is, whereas perhaps China played a huge role as an investor all across Africa, now maybe there's more consideration given to others as well. And then without maybe a single investor, single dominant investor, I think it's important, very important to think a little bit about where the money does come from, where the investment comes from.
Where do you think it's coming from into Africa?
I think one has to look, and maybe this takes also the model of Dubai and the Middle East, which is to be open to the world, right? I think there's many different probably interests in Africa in different ways, and I think probably that can be used as a basis for attracting even more investment. I think certainly, whether it's China specifically or other Asian countries, I think Singapore has also shown it's quite active as an investor as well. I think there's other opportunities there.
What about the political leadership in Africa? I've been studying Africa for quite a long time, about a quarter of a century, and I think that I get the feeling that a lot of even long-standing African leaders are getting a bit more pragmatic, a bit more savvy when it comes to dealing with the international investment community. What's the feeling you're getting from on the ground in your work?
Well, I think we see that as well. I think it is. It takes a balance. I think it's important to kind of show that there's even not just say a leader, a friendly leader, someone to do business with, but that the infrastructure is there as well. That when someone's investing, that there's also a system at which one can get a return. So, I think what that means is leaders have to do the things to attract the investment, but they also have to show reforms, they have to stamp out corruption, they have to show that the rest of the economy is more attractive to that investment. So I think that's what we're starting to see is a bit more, let's say, holistic thinking about the environment with which an investment comes in.
I mean, what about some of the sort of political noise that we still see? I mean, not just in Africa, around the world. There's still a lot of posturing, unfortunately, on the political front. Do you think there'll ever come a time when maybe countries will see that as just a bit of noise and that the real deal is about how to attract new and vibrant capital into your economy? When do you think that'll be?
Well, I'd like to think it is political noise, and this is where I would again go back to some of the younger populations that are more connected than ever, right? They will help the economy develop, I think, in a very profound and productive way, right? They'll connect and hopefully transcend maybe the role that individual leaders played. So again, I'm somewhat optimistic that that'll be a positive influence.
What about the huge infrastructure gap? We're talking about connectivity, and there is a massive tens of billions of dollars needed in infrastructure. Who's going to fill that gap? Is it going to be private or public money?
Well, I don't think it can be just public money. I think it has to be a blend. And this is again where I think doing deals the right way that both attract investment but that have the right backing, not only with money, government money, but also through policy and maybe regulatory changes, the right infrastructure around it that make an investment more attractive. So I think it needs to be a balance. It needs to be both public and private.
And in terms of that huge population, young people, I say in the one way it's an asset, another way it's a threat. Do you think African economies can get their act together in time to get this huge population to work and part of the economy?
Well, I think it's a challenge. I also think it's why one needs to move with some pace as well, because I think as much as we talk about these younger generations, they're also quite impatient. They want to see things happen quickly. And this is again where maybe this region here, Dubai, the UAE, the Middle East, they're making big changes and they're trying to move very quickly in the changes they make. Diversification, openness, how to do business, how to improve one's standing in doing business. All of these things are happening at, say, a very rapid pace.
Not such a rapid pace is the African Free Trade Area. A lot of hopes for it in the future. I know it's going to take time. Europe took more than half a century to get its trading bloc together. But long term, what are your hopes for it, do you think?
Well, I think it starts with intra-African trade, right? And back to what we talked about before with trends towards localization. I think if you put together all the resources across Africa, there is a huge opportunity to do business within Africa. So I think as a starting point, doing that, will create tremendous benefits for Africa as a whole. I think that'll also help to make Africa more attractive. We're talking about investment. Africa will become more attractive as an investment destination when they can better connect the different parts of the continent.
And what are your hopes for it? I mean, some people say maybe 20 years, maybe longer. How are you reading it?
Yeah, I think 20 years. Again, this is where I think the pace continues to quicken, right? And whereas maybe things took a while. You mentioned before the expo, the original expo in London. Mm-hmm. We've come a long way since then, luckily. And I think as we learn about what happens between trading partners, my hope is that Africa can move much more quickly.
And just lastly, as a professional working in business on the continent, the future, what do you think for the continent?
Well, I'm optimistic, and again, I've said it probably throughout our discussion, Chris. I think that, again, there's been probably the decades of Africa declared, yet, at the same time, there's been some steady progress with probably quite a few setbacks. Yet, again, with newer generations coming, greater connectivity in almost everything we do, I'm optimistic that this is the time, and this goes to your point about leadership as well. With better leadership, we can pull together a very important population in the world, and something that I think the whole global economy sees as a benefit.
Thank you very much for your time indeed. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of Captains of Industry in Dubai. I've been speaking to Bob Willen, the Managing Director and Partner for Global Consultants, A.T. Kearney. And from me, here in the studio in Dubai, from Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.